When you talk to people in strongly religious communities, you sometimes notice an interesting reaction when the word atheist comes up. It's not always anger, sometimes it's discomfort, suspicion, even fear. The question is, why? It's not as if atheists, by definition, have a shared agenda to harm anyone. In fact, the vast majority live ordinary lives, working jobs, raising families, paying bills, just like anyone else. And yet, surveys in many countries show that atheists are among the least trusted groups in society. In some polls, people say they would rather vote for a politician of almost any faith than one who openly identifies as having none. This fear often isn't about the individual atheist in front of them. It's about what they believe atheism represents. For many religious people, faith isn't just a personal choice, it's a foundation for morality, purpose, and identity. To reject that faith, in their eyes, is to reject the very things that make life meaningful and good. And if someone can live without that foundation, it raises uncomfortable questions. Some fear that without belief in a divine authority, there's nothing to stop people from doing whatever they want, no matter how harmful. Even if an atheist lives ethically, the absence of religious motivation can feel suspicious, as if their morality isn't anchored to anything solid. To those who see morality as inseparable from religion, that's unsettling. There's also the fear of influence. Religious communities are often protective of their members, especially children and teenagers. An atheist might be seen as a potential threat to faith, someone who could plant seeds of doubt just by existing openly. It's not that they expect a direct argument, sometimes it's simply the example of someone living a good life without belief that feels dangerous, because it challenges the narrative that faith is essential, and beneath all of this is another layer, the fear of being wrong. Most people don't think about this consciously, but the possibility that someone can live a fulfilling, moral, and meaningful life without the beliefs you hold can create a kind of quiet, unspoken anxiety. It's not easy to confront ideas that could undermine something you've built your whole worldview on. That's why the fear isn't always expressed as fear. Sometimes it shows up as hostility, mockery, or avoidance. It's easier to dismiss someone than to wrestle with the possibility that they might have a valid point, but this reaction isn't universal, and it's not set in stone. Understanding where it comes from is the first step toward addressing it. The suspicion toward atheists isn't new. If you look back through history, disbelief in the gods, whether in ancient Greece, medieval Europe, or other religious cultures, has often been treated as dangerous, even criminal. In many times and places, being an open non-believer could mean losing your social standing, your freedom, or even your life. Part of this is because religion has so often been intertwined with power. In societies where the authority of rulers was tied to divine approval, denying the gods wasn't just a personal choice, it was seen as undermining the entire social order. If the king ruled by the will of God, and you questioned God's existence, you were questioning the legitimacy of the king himself. This legacy lingers. Even in countries with separation of church and state, religion still holds cultural power. And when something holds power, it naturally resists anything that could weaken it. Atheism, simply by existing, offers an alternative lens for looking at the world, one that doesn't depend on that religious framework. To some, that's not just different, it's threatening. Cultural narratives reinforce this. In many religious traditions, morality is framed as a gift from the divine, something humans could not develop or sustain on their own. From that perspective, a person who lives outside the faith but still claims to have morals must be in denial or borrowing from religious ideas. This reinforces the belief that atheists are at best misguided, and at worst deceptive. There's also the issue of group identity. In tightly knit religious communities, belief is a marker of belonging. To say you don't believe is to step outside that shared identity. For some, that's enough to cast you as other, even if you've done nothing else to separate yourself. And once someone is in the other category, it's easy for suspicion to grow. In more extreme cases, fear of atheists comes from outright misinformation. Some religious teachings still portray non-believers as inherently immoral, nihilistic, or even dangerous. This portrayal doesn't have to match reality, it just has to be repeated often enough to feel true. When you've been told since childhood that people without faith are lost, corrupt, or cold-hearted, meeting a kind and ethical atheist can be confusing, and sometimes, confusion turns into resistance rather than curiosity. It's important to remember that these fears are rarely about the atheist as a person. They're about what the atheist represents to the believer's worldview. And that's why conversations about belief and non-belief often feel so charged. They're not just about ideas, they're about identity, security, and belonging. Fear of atheists often isn't really about atheists, it's about how the human brain responds when something threatens its deepest frameworks. Psychologists sometimes call this worldview defense. Our beliefs about life, death, morality, and meaning aren't just ideas we hold, they're part of how we make sense of everything. They help us feel grounded in a chaotic world. When those beliefs are challenged, it can create what's called cognitive dissonance, a tension between the way we see the world and the possibility that it might not be accurate. That tension isn't comfortable. In fact, research in social psychology shows that when people feel their worldview is under threat, they often double down on it, becoming even more certain, not less. This is why, in some cases, the more exposure someone has to opposing views, the more defensive they can become, at least at first. Religion often amplifies this because it's not just about facts or ideas, it's tied to emotion, community, and sometimes fear of eternal consequences. For someone who believes that rejecting faith leads to terrible outcomes after death, meeting an atheist isn't a neutral encounter. It's loaded with implications. Even if they don't consciously think it, there may be an instinctive reaction. If this person is right, then everything I've built my life on is in question. On a neurological level, the brain can react to these challenges as if they're threats to survival. The amygdala, the part of the brain involved in fear and emotional processing, can become active when people are confronted with beliefs that contradict their own core values. That's why these conversations can feel tense, even when no one is raising their voice. In addition, humans are wired for what's called in-group bias. We're more likely to trust and cooperate with people we see as part of our group, and more likely to be wary of those we see as outsiders. If religion defines the group, then atheists, by definition, fall outside of it. And that outsider status can trigger everything from mild suspicion to outright hostility. Understanding this doesn't excuse prejudice, but it helps explain why it can persist even when it doesn't make logical sense. A religious person might meet an atheist who is generous, honest, and compassionate, and still feel a subtle mistrust. That feeling often has little to do with the individual in front of them, and more to do with centuries of cultural programming and the brain's own protective instincts. The irony is that, in many cases, the fear can dissolve once there's real personal connection. When people actually know someone who doesn't share their beliefs, stereotypes often fade. But getting to that point requires breaking through the initial wall of mistrust. One of the most telling things about fear of atheists is how often it fades with personal contact. Sociologists have studied this through something called the contact hypothesis, the idea that when members of different groups interact under the right conditions, prejudice tends to decrease. And in the case of atheists, this pattern shows up clearly. People who say they personally know a non-believer often report warmer feelings toward atheists than those who don't. This isn't about lengthy debates or converting anyone. Sometimes it's just the quiet familiarity that comes from working side by side, sharing meals, or raising kids in the same neighborhood. Over time, the label atheist becomes less of an abstract threat and more of a real person you respect or even care about. There have been studies in the US showing that simply being exposed to portrayals of non-believers in the media, especially positive or neutral ones, can shift attitudes. If all you've heard about atheists comes from a religious pulpit that frames them as dangerous or immoral, then seeing a non-believer portrayed as a relatable, ethical person can be enough to plant a seed of doubt about those stereotypes. Real-world examples back this up. In communities where interfaith or secular religious collaborations happen, like volunteering together for disaster relief, charity drives, or social justice causes, the walls often come down. People realize they can work toward shared goals without needing to share a theology. But here's the catch: for that kind of change to happen, there has to be enough openness to let those encounters occur. In highly insular communities, where members mostly interact with people of the same belief, fear of atheists can persist indefinitely, not because it's tested and confirmed, but because it's never challenged at all. It's also worth noting that fear is sometimes kept alive intentionally. In some religious contexts, portraying non-believers as dangerous serves a purpose. It reinforces group unity and discourages members from seeking ideas outside the approved framework. If you convince people that outsiders will corrupt them, you make it less likely they'll ever form the kind of personal connections that would undermine that belief. Still, in a more connected world, those walls are harder to maintain. In the end, the fear some religious people have toward atheists isn't really about knowing the facts, it's about protecting something deeply personal. Belief systems are more than ideas, they're part of identity, family history, and community belonging. When an atheist walks into that space, they can be seen as a living contradiction, proof that life without faith is possible. And that possibility can feel destabilizing, but fear is rarely the full story. Many religious people don't feel threatened at all. Some are curious. Some are respectful. And some even find value in having friendships and conversations across the belief divide. The difference often comes down to exposure, empathy, and the willingness to see someone as a whole person rather than a label. That's why breaking down this fear isn't about winning arguments. It's about connection. It's about showing, through everyday actions, that morality, kindness, and integrity aren't owned by any one worldview. Over time, those quiet, consistent examples can do more to shift perception than any debate could, and for those who still hold on to fear, the reality is that it often says more about their own uncertainties than about the people they fear. Sometimes, what looks like distrust is really a silent wrestling match with doubt. And while doubt can be uncomfortable, it's also a sign that the mind is capable of growth. The truth is, we all live in a world full of people who see it differently. We can let those differences divide us, or we can see them as an opportunity to test, refine, and deepen our own understanding. Fear tends to shrink when we choose the second option. So, do religious people fear atheists? Sometimes, yes. But the more we talk, the more we listen, and the more we live side by side, the more that fear becomes something else entirely: respect, maybe even trust.